Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to Workshop Wednesday today. Thanks for joining me. We have a really, a topic that I really love to teach on because a lot of people know about taking your general body measurements, you know, your bust, your waist, and your hip. But today with length, we're talking more about the distance between those circumference measurements. And I feel like that really sheds a lot of clarity around why things don't fit properly and how we can get a better fit. So welcome to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer. Thanks for joining me in my workshop, in my cutting room with my fabrics, my table, and we're going to talk about adding length to the pattern pieces today. So adding or subtracting, lengthening or shortening up pieces, where and how you would want to do that, and how to figure out what the right adjustment is for your piece. So that's always the key, is really figuring out what is the right adjustment for you and your body, and also for the individual projects that we work on. And yeah, so thanks for sending in all the questions, everyone. We had a ton of questions this week. And I was just mentioning to a few of the ladies here in the Zoom room that I'm going to break those down into some subtopics. So we had tons of questions about sway backs, how to fit a sway back. And so I'm going to break that actually into its own Workshop Wednesday day so that we can really cover it in a really comprehensive way to make sure that you do get all of the insight that you need for that. So hold tight there. Kaylee and Kathleen, and I think there was a couple others that sent in topics around that. We'll get to that in March. And then other Kathy, we're going to talk about today a couple tips as well for when your seams like to twist and roll. So that'll be right at the end of today's class. And then we're going to jump in. Oh, I did also have another question from Ruby. She sent in around how to hem her skirt properly. She has a pleated skirt that she needs to hem. And I'm going to reach out to you personally and see if we can get you on Workshop Wednesday just to talk about your project and to get some really individualized insight on that, because that's what I love about the Fitting Fashion program that I teach, is that we really get to dive into the projects that you're working on and what techniques work for that. And since sewing is so visual, it's always great to really see the implementation of the tips and what kind of situation they work in and the effect that they have. And that always just really solidifies the concept and helps you know really how to make the decisions and to pick the right technique in each different situation. So that'll be exciting as well. So today we're going to jump into Carol's questions around how to actually lengthen the pieces when she wants to add to like a skirt or a top, and a few things to think about that way. Also, if you have a long or short torso, then this is going to be really helpful for you as well. Okay, so measuring. We all know you got to take your bust, your waist, and your hip measurements, circumference measurements, to decide on the size. But we also know we're all different heights and different proportions. So if you don't actually measure the length that you want for your garment, it can end up being too short, and there's not always the possibility of adding, you know, a band seam to add a couple inches, or you might not want to add a ruffle on the bottom of all your garments to give yourself the length that you need. Now, when a garment is too long, you can always cut it shorter, but that also doesn't mean that the waist is going to hit you where the waist needs to hit you, and that all of those circumference measurements are actually in correct proportion with each other. When you shorten it up, it might get too narrow for where it needs to sit on your hips, or again, too wide. So really understanding how to measure length, as well as understanding the distance in between your circumference measurements, is the key to really getting the proportions, not just the width, but also in the height, in the proper order, so that you can save yourself alterations and also frustration for when those things are too tight. So, okay. Let's talk about quickly here what kind of measurements you would need for which type of pieces. So when you're measuring like a top, you'll definitely want to measure the front from the top to the bust point, from the bust point to the waist, and from the waist to your hip or your hemline. You'll also need to measure straight down the back, just because, especially depending on how much bust you have, it will be a longer measurement across the front than you will have down your back. So comparing those two is really important. It's a little bit tricky measuring length on a side seam, just because it will depend on where your armhole starts. If you have a very fitted sleeve, or if you have a looser sleeve, like I have here on this sweater. You can always check your side seams to make sure that they line up once you've lengthened your front and your back piece, just to make sure that when you piece your garment together, that those seams will line up. But it's more important to measure right across from the top of the shoulder down over the bust point to the waist and then to the hip. Now, when you're measuring for a skirt, you would want to measure the front length of your skirt as well as the back length, depending on how much booty you have. Is the same kind of effect as with the bust. It could be a longer measurement. And same with the hip. That's why you need to measure the front, middle, as well as the hip. If you have really curvy hips, you might need extra length on the side, which is often why, especially in fitted patterns, there is a little bit of height difference and a little bit of curve in how the pattern is when it's laying flat, yet when you put it on your body, it looks like that waistline is horizontal around. So always measure front, middle, back, middle, and side seam to your desired length of hem for a skirt. And then for pants, you'll want to measure the side seam again from wherever you want your waistline down to wherever you want your hem, as well as the inseam of your pants, so that you'll have those measurements. Perfect. So here we have a couple different pattern pieces. Now, it really is the same concept, regardless of if it's a top piece, if it's a full-length dress, if it's a pant leg or sleeve. Here I have a sleeve. The difference is really to think about if you have a tapering piece or if you have a flaring piece, and how that will affect lengthening your pattern piece. Now, when we have taken our measurements and we know that we need extra length on our piece, whatever that may be, you can always simply just add it to the bottom of your pattern and extend. I'm just going to once again, I'm just letting a couple people join in here, so we'll get everybody logged in and then keep going. So yes, here I'm working on a pattern piece that has a flare at the hem, and I'm just going to assume that we're going to add, I'm just going to work in centimeters since my pieces are so small, just 6 centimeters right across the board on this pattern. And I'm also just going to extend out that side seam, continuing the original shape. As you can see here, I'll just fill in a couple little marking lines and just freestyle this. Just keep it quick. And then as you can see here, our hem has gotten longer. Our pattern piece has gotten wider. Now, this is not necessarily a problem. If you have a really flowy skirt, for example, and it's just a short skirt, you may want it to extend all the way down to the hem if you're making a full length skirt. Where this can be an issue is, for example, especially on a skirt, if you're adding that much length to it, your pattern piece is getting wider and wider, and at some point it might get too wide for your fabric. So then you might want to ensure that you're not flaring out too much that way, or in another case, you may want to make sure that your hemline stays the same. So I'm just going to trace this pattern real quick on the top and give you an example. So if we knew we didn't want the hem length or size to adjust, then it's really easy to just mark where the length is you want to add to it and trace the top of your pattern and just slide it down and trace the bottom part. Now, if we do it this way, what changes? Our hem is the same length, so especially if we have any adjoining pieces like a band, or if this was a sleeve and had a cuff, then they would match up. Or if this is a top with part of a dress with a bottom skirt, then we know the pieces that attach to it are going to fit. However, we do have some shape difference in the side seam. Our pattern has become narrower for longer. So this would mean that the circumference measurements that were given on the pattern, our bust, and especially our waist, we can see the waist here has become smaller. The circumference measurements may be too small. So it's important to make sure that if you need that extra width or the original size of the pattern at the waist, that you keep it original and then taper it after. So I'm actually just going to use the ruler here so that you can see through it. So if I keep my waist at the original size, but I want to have my hem at the original size as well, I'm going to use a curved edge since this is a curve as well. Then I would taper it just in between the waist and the hem instead of tapering it all along the length. So this is where you can see that it's really important that your circumference measurements, where your horizontal lines are placed, this being your bust measurement, this being your waist measurement, that those are at the right height and that your pattern is the right width for each of those at the right spot. So this is where measuring the distance from your shoulder to your bust point, from your bust point to your waist, from your waist to your hem or your hip line is really crucial. If you had a really, like Diane mentioned that she always has, because of her short torso, the waistline isn't where her waist needs to be. So even though this might be the right size for her waist, if her waist is sitting up here, everything's going to be too loose on her waist. But then what happens after your waist? It starts to flare out to your hip, and her pattern pieces are still getting narrower as she already needs a flare. So this is where she would need to, instead of adjusting, just chopping off her top, she would need to adjust it in between, and to know where, if you need to adjust it in between the bust line or the waist hip line itself, that would be those measurements in between. So if you're really just looking, especially on a loose fitting garment, to ensure that your top is going to be long enough, you can measure just straight from the top to where you want your hemline. But if you have any proportional differences in between, you'll want to measure in between your horizontal lines and make sure that those are sliding accordingly. Oftentimes, if you feel like once you've made a pattern that the bust is sitting too high, it's just kind of gapy and bulky above your bust, but you don't have the fullness that you need at your bust line, then you need extra length in this quadrant, right? So that would, sliding it down would bring the bust line to where you need your bust line. Or once again, if your darts are ending way below your bust, where your bust is sitting, then that needs to be brought up. So it most likely needs to be shortened here. at the strap. So measuring in between those lines is what's really going to help you know where you need to shorten or where you need to lengthen your pattern piece. Now let's take a little look here at this tapered piece. So with a tapered piece, the opposite is true of the flared. When we just continue straight off the end, it's going to add a little bit of length and create it just from a continuous straight line off the end of our piece. Our hem circumference is going to become smaller. So once again, if you follow me in my Fitting Fashion mini series or as a private client, you'll know that you'll always need to double check if adjoining pieces on a sleeve, a cuff, for example, is going to fit, or if the cuff is then going to be too big, or even on your own wrist, if the circumference measurement is still going to be okay, or if that's going to be too narrow. Once again, you can also do a slide technique if you didn't want the length to, or the circumference of the hem of your sleeve to get smaller. And when it comes to pattern adjusting, you really can adjust either the pattern itself or just slide your pattern around when you're cutting it out, or you can just create a new pattern if you want to keep your original pattern for the future. There's lots of ways to actually do the physical adjustments that you need as well. Now here, once again, if we look at the difference between sliding and here, now we have our original hem circumference. It would change. I'm just going to do one side all the way through maybe. It's changing where our circumference lines are on this piece. So here we'd measure for sleeve from the shoulder point to your bicep, from your bicep to your elbow, from your elbow to your hem of the sleeve, and those circumference measurements obviously need to be large enough that you can get your arm in and out. And if we just lengthen it, then it might be too tight for you. So you would want to double check the circumference on your arm, or if you slid it down, depending on how you blend the side seam, your sleeve might get too wide. Since this is the original line and this is the blended line to keep our original width. So when you have your horizontal lines measured and marked in, then you can double check and see, has the sleeve grown too wide, or is the sleeve going to be too narrow on me? But that is the main thing with adding length directly, is if you have a tapered or a flared piece, is that they'll either grow or get narrower, and you need to adjust for that. Now, there is also, as we mentioned at the beginning, the difference with going over the protrusion of the bust is longer than going straight down the back. And that can also mean that you don't want to add or take away the same amount consistently on the bottom of your top. You may want it to be longer in the back and fade out to the original side seam. You may want it to be shorter in the front, or in the case of a sway back, you may want it to be shorter in the back. So you do not have to add evenly across always on your patterns. You may need to do it a little bit more on one piece than in the other. And that again is what makes taking the measurement of the front and the back length to this location you want your hem so crucial. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of reasons for a twisting hem. We had a question there from Kathleen about her hems cut on a curve always getting twisted. So the most simple explanation for that is, since whenever we're folding up a curve, the outer, the raw edge, the cut edge that we're folding in is longer. We have extra length. And when we're stitching it along, it often wants to kind of roll and rotate because it wants to attach kind of proportionally along that seam. The trick is, I guess it is the drawback to hemming things on a curve is that you'll always run into this issue. The bonus is if it's cut on a curve, there will be somewhat of a bias cut involved. So we all know that with bias band, you can kind of shape and mold it. So you can kind of shape and mold your hem to shorten up that extra length. Sometimes it's easier than others depending on the looseness of the weave and different things like that. But the two kind of most important tips that I can give you for that is to keep it from twisting. You really need to make sure that you are kind of staying square with where you are folding it up. So when you fold it and iron it beforehand, you can help kind of shorten that length and ensure that it's all going to be laying straight. So pressing your hems before in a situation of a curve is really helpful. Using really narrow hems is also really helpful because then the transition or the extra length you need to feed in is less if you're just folding it up a tiny bit as opposed to folding it up and doing a really wide hem on any kind of curved or flared pieces. But ironing it or pressing it in beforehand can be really helpful. The other thing that you can do is keep a nice square fold, how you fold it up, and just pin it every once in a while. Because then when you know, if you get to the pin and you have extra length on your seam allowance raw edge, you know you're starting to twist. And if you continue like that, your hem is going to get that little roll or twist to it. So having those pins, if it doesn't really work to iron it, or even ironing it and pinning it, keeping it nice and square will help you to ensure that you're not getting twisted as you move through the hem. Now, if you have a really curved hem, then really the only two finishes that you can do is either a super, super narrow, which is another reason why I love rolled hems, or you can do kind of a facing or a bias cut band or facing on the inside of the garment so that you can really shape with that curve and you don't need to fold a lot of seam allowance up and into your garment. Okay. I feel like that was a lot of content in a short amount of time. It's off now. Yes, you can always go back and watch it on the Facebook page and comment or ask any questions. If you have any questions, need a little more clarity about any of the tips that we covered today. And then of course you can always email me as well. So I am posting these on YouTube as well. I don't really have much of a channel going, but if you do look up Chelsea Busmeyer, if you're not on Facebook, but you want to rewatch it, then you'll be able to find the Workshop Wednesday playlist and rewatch any of our Workshop Wednesday episodes. So thank you for joining me today, and we will see you next week on Workshop Wednesday.